Walt Whitman was born and grew up in New York State. He'd taken out of school at 11 to work at his father's law firm.
Walt Whitman was the man who revolutionized American poetry. He invented a whole new poetic form, and he opened up topics to a wide range that nobody else would touch.
When Whitman was a young man, he became a journalist.
As a result, Whitman was largely self-taught.
He became a voracious reader. He read widely, especially in novels.
Most of Whitman's meaningful education came outside of school. He visited museums, went to libraries, and attended lectures. His formal education ended at the age of 11, when he began working as an errand boy at a Brooklyn law firm. Throughout his life, Whitman preferred idleness to nose-to-the-grindstone labor, and it was this penchant for idleness that allowed him to be the keen observer and poet that he was. His employers encouraged him to read by giving him a library subscription, and this became a signal event of his life. Whitman forged his own rough and informal curriculum of literature, theater, history, geography, music, and archaeology, in contrast to the structured education of his contemporary poets.
When he was 17, Whitman turned to teaching, and his first job was in a one-room schoolhouse. He taught for 5 years, and then in 1841, he set his sights on journalism.
Influenced by a feud with his father, many of his stories centered around a son being treated badly by his father. By the mid-1840s, Whitman had a keen awareness of the cultural resources of New York City and probably had more inside knowledge of New York journalism than anyone else in Brooklyn. The Long Island Star recognized his value as a journalist, and once he resettled in Brooklyn, quickly arranged to have him compose a series of editorials from September 1845 to March 1846.
He had a successful career as a journalist, going on to be editor of papers such as Brooklyn Daily Eagle and Crescent. He started 2 publications in his career, the Long Islander in 1838 and Brooklyn Freeman in 1848.
He had strong ideas about women's property rights, about immigration, and about the major issue of the day, slavery.
The populous city of New Orleans imprinted his brain with its shows, architecture, customs, traditions, etc., which surfaced in poems in his book, Leaves of Grass. A pivotal and empowering change came over Whitman at this time of poetic transformation. His politics, and especially his racial attitudes, underwent a profound alteration. Prior to his journey to New Orleans, Whitman advanced the interest of white working men, while seeming at times unconcerned about the plight of blacks. However, the New Orleans experience had prompted a change in attitude, a change that was intensified by an increasing number of friendships with radical thinkers and writers who led Whitman to rethink his attitudes towards the issue of race. As a result, in Whitman's future-oriented poetry, blacks became central to his new literary project and central to his understanding of democracy.
From 1848 to 1855, Whitman began what was to become his greatest work, Leaves of Grass. His free verse, his stitching together of encyclopedic lists, completely broke with poetic and literary convention and vastly influenced poets ever after across the world.
Whitman self-published his first work, Leaves of Grass, in 1855. This included 12 poems. This work took a turn from regular poetry, changing from third person to first person, breaking away from a meter structure and leaning more towards prose. Leaves of Grass did not receive much notice when it was published, but Ralph Waldo Emerson gave it high praise, calling it an extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom. Later in the year, Whitman published a second edition of Leaves of Grass, with 32 poems. This edition didn't sell very well, but it did spur a meeting with Henry David Thoreau and Bronson Alcott. The third edition did not get printed officially because the publisher went out of business during the Civil War. A pirated copy of Leaves of Grass did become available, though.
During the Civil War, Whitman moved to Washington, D.C. to attend his wounded brother George. He stayed in D.C. several years, working in the paymaster's office, and volunteered, visiting wounded soldiers.
When he went to the hospitals, there were limbs piled up outside. He spoke with young soldiers who had witnessed the most astonishing atrocities.
From his experience with the wounded during the war, he produced a small book of poems called Drum Taps. This is one of the only 2 accounts of the Civil War written by people who actually experienced it.
Even after the war, Whitman visited soldiers. It was through this that he met Peter Doyle, a young Confederate soldier. They had a strong romantic connection. Their relationship eventually moved from romance to friendship in the end, though.
In the late 1850s, Walt liked to jump off the omnibus at Broadway and Bleecker, where he could descend among the revelers at an underground saloon called Pfaff's.
Pfaff's was the Andy Warhol factory, the Studio 54, the Algonquin Round Table, all rolled into one.
It's a place where a lot of the theatrical set winds up. He's meeting cross-dressers and all sorts of other edgy types. It's bohemia for Whitman. And he realizes he kind of fits in there. He starts wearing these pants called bloomers, which were the first pants that women wore, and they were kind of like pantaloons, very fluffy. But Whitman kind of wore them flamboyantly and tucked them into his boots and, you know, basically wore women's pants.
Additionally, Pfaff's was a place to pick up beautiful young men. And it's very funny in reading some of the earlier histories of Pfaff's. The heterosexual white guys who are writing seem always to wonder, why would he go to Pfaff's so often? Duh, I can tell you why. It was where all the other outlaws gathered.
One flitting glimpse, caught through an interstice, of a youth who loves me and whom I love, silently approaching and seating himself near, that he may hold me by the hand. And long while, amid the noises of coming and going, there we two, content, happy in being together, speaking a little, perhaps not a word.
Of all the young men he met at Pfaff's, Fred Vaughan, an Irishman, was the person that he felt closest to. In the 2 or 3 years Whitman lived away from home, Fred Vaughan was his roommate, was his pal.
And that night, while all was still, I heard the waters roll slowly, continually up the shores. I heard the hissing rustle of the liquid and sands as directed to me, whispering, to congratulate me. For the one I loved most lay sleeping by me under the same cover. In the cool night, in the autumn moonbeams, his face was inclined toward me, and his arm lay lightly around my breast. And that night,
Over the next years, Whitman released Democratic Vistas, Passage to India, and the 5th edition of Leaves of Grass.
Whitman was called the Bard of Democracy because all of his poems are based on the notion of a universal brotherhood. He thought that the possibility of America was to achieve a brotherhood that no other culture had yet been able to achieve.
Whitman suffered a stroke in 1873, leaving him partially paralyzed. He moved to Camden, New Jersey, where he remained until his death on March 26, 1892.
In his lifetime, Leaves of Grass was considered by many people to be a disgraceful book. But by the end of his life, he acquired the name the Good Gray Poet, as if America was finally ready in the later years to accept him as a poet.
Whitman never really received the attention that he deserved during his lifetime. It was only in the 20th century that we learned how to read his poetry and understand what he accomplished.
Walt Whitman on Leaves of Grass.
As you read through his little notebook, you can see the moment where Leaves of Grass begins to emerge. In typical Whitman fashion, there are all kinds of things in this notebook. Little notations of what he owes people, and he's got addresses and names of people and places that he has to go. And then he begins writing in prose. He starts out saying, "Be simple and clear. Be not occult." He's looking for his voice, and at one point he says, every soul has its own individual voice. And then he has a line that I've always been fascinated with. It says, "Do not descend among professors and capitalists." And he stops at that point, and there are a couple of blank pages. And then when you turn the page, suddenly there it is. And it starts, "I am the poet of slaves and of the masters of slaves. I am the poet of the body, and I am," and then he stops. And in that moment where he writes, "and I am," I can feel the moment where Whitman senses that I that is going to become his main character in all of his poems. That I has come into existence, and I am. And then he crosses those lines out, and there's a little space, and then he writes the first lines that are going to get into Leaves of Grass. "I am the poet of the body, and I am the poet of the soul. I go with the slaves of the earth equally with the masters, and I will stand between the master and the slaves, entering into both so that both will understand me alike." And there it is. Everything that's going to be great in Whitman is in those lines.
Out of that small notebook grew a thin volume with 12 untitled poems, typeset by the hand of the poet.
I celebrate myself, and what I assume you shall assume.
For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul.
I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass.
The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yop over the roofs of the world.
I speak the password primeval. I give the sign of democracy. By God, I will accept nothing which all cannot have their counterpart of on the same terms. Through me, forbidden voices. Voices of sexes and lusts. Voices veiled and I remove the veil. Voices indecent by me, clarified and transfigured.
Here was the first truly American poet who broke out of the form of formal poetry. You know how in a sonnet you have these boundaries. Leaves of Grass is a poem without boundaries, and so that everything can flood into it. People, professions, landscape, memories, engineering, water, children, Native Americans. There's no boundaries keeping anything out.
Leaves of Grass contained astronomy, mythology, Egyptology, religions of the East and West, and the latest science. The sublime operatic line and the blunt, coarse talk of the 5 points were in Leaves. The carpenter, the printer, the half-breed, patriarchs, prostitutes, opium eaters, and the president himself peopled the poems. The squaw in her yellow-hemmed cloth was there on the page, the bride in her white dress, Kentuckian, Georgian, and Californian. What joined them to one another was the firm embrace of the poet himself, who was, after all, just one of the crowd.
Whitman portrays himself on the title page in the frontispiece without his name, but with an image of himself unlike any image of a poet before. It's not the poet from the shoulders up, dressed in formal dress, which emphasizes the poetry that comes from the intellect, the poetry that comes from a life of privilege and education. Instead, this is poetry that comes from a life of walking in the streets. It's the poetry that emerges through the hands and arms and through the heart pumping blood to all parts of the body. And the perspiration, the aroma of these armpits. Whitman talks about aroma finer than prayer.
This is everything about sinews. This was everything about crotch. This was everything about armpits. For him, you couldn't have an honest poetry that wasn't including the whole person.
Nakedness from the first page is celebrated. Whitman's openness and celebration of sexuality, and not just heterosexual sex, but sex on the edges, masturbation, voyeurism, oral sex. It's in there.
Come, said my soul, such verses for my body let us write. For we are one, that should I after return, or long, long hence in other spheres, in other spheres, there to some group of mates the chant resuming, tallying her soil trees winds tumultuous waves, ever with pleased smile I may keep on, ever and ever yet the verse is owning as first I hear and now, signing for soul and body, said to them my name, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman on Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism rejected the idea of organized religion and believed that everyone is in a private relationship with the universe. Essentially, Transcendentalists want to break from norms and they want everyone to be their own person, making their own choices. Whitman's poems were at the forefront of the Transcendentalist movement. His poems broke free from the norms that popular poetry set for every poet. Transcendentalism explores the relationship between man, nature, and their spiritual self. Whitman's Leaves of Grass explores this. The poems Come Said My Soul and I Hear America Singing have transcendentalist undertones. This will be explored more in the explication. So this is the explication for Come Said My Soul. We're going to start with the verse 1, which is Come Said My Soul, which is basically Walt's separating himself from his soul. So line 1, he separates himself from his soul, and then line 2, such verses from my body let us write, for we are one. He then separates his body from his soul to him actual himself, basically his ego. For we are one. They're separate, but they're one. They're equal. They basically work together to create poetry. And line 3, that should I, after death, invisibly return. So even though Walt Whitman and his body will die, his poetry will live on. Because in line 4 it says, or long, long hence in other spheres. So his poetry is going to live in other spheres, as in nature, people, and the world. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be poems written on trees or anything, but the words will resonate still in more of like a spiritual context. This is the beginning of like a transcendental idea. There to some groups of mates, the chanting resuming. So people will be chanting his poems, but they're not going to be actually chanting his poems, just what they represent. Tallying earth soils, trees, winds, tumultuous waves. So in the nature and the world and with people, you're going to find his poetry, basically his messages of life. So we have ever with please smile, I may keep on, which is ever with please smile. Smile means he's accepting. Walt Whitman is accepting this Trinity as reality. Ever and ever, yet the verse is owning, basically saying ever and ever, but the poetry is written and I don't do anything. Walt Whitman doesn't do anything. As first I hear and now, but he's in the present moment with his body and his soul. And then line 9, it says, signing for soul and body, set them to my name. So the body and the soul really create the poetry. But Walt Whitman, his job is to sign for them because they can't do it. They are not, they can't be they're not inanimate objects. They're not people. He is writing for them, but they do the work. And the 10th line is his signature, Walt Whitman. Acting or being the placeholder for his body and his soul. Now, we have some things. First off, this is more of another transcendental idea, because where do we see another Trinity? And I wrote it over here in the corner, which is in Christian ideology, which is the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Holy Trinity. But Walt Whitman wasn't really a Christian, but he did believe in the transcendentalist movement. It's all about spirituality. And so we have this idea of the Trinity. And it's, again, we see it in Christian theme, but a proper Christian would believe in the Trinity and accept that that is the truth. And Walt Whitman does the same. He is Walt Whitman, the body and the soul, and then on line 7, he smiles, accepting that this is the reality. The only thing different in the Christian ideology, they basically produce the person. But Walt Whitman is a part of the group that produces the poetry. Walt Whitman was a spiritualist of some kind, and we do just find these themes in every poem. If you read more into it, you can find plenty of spiritual messages throughout the poems. So that's an important part of what made Walt Whitman Walt Whitman.
I hear America singing. I hear America singing the varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be blithe and strong. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam, the mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work, the boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat, the deckhand singing on the steamboat deck. The shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench, the hatter singing as he stands, the woodcutter's song, the plowboy on his way into work, or at noon intermission or at sundown. The delicious singing of the mother, of the young wife at work, of the girl sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. The day what belonged to the day, at night the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious song.
I hear America singing. Explication. We're going to start with the first line of the poem, which is, I hear America singing the varied carols I hear. And right here, I just made a diagram. It's basically, I would consider this an arc. And this is Walt Whitman's home to America and being an American. So we have down here, Walt Whitman is hearing America singing, and it's basically the exposition, bringing us to where we need to be, and he's gonna get ready to bring us on this journey to show us how much he loves America. So from lines 2 to 10, I'm not going to say all of them, but like line number 2, those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be, blithe and strong. Basically, Walt Whitman, what he's doing in line 2 through 10, and he's building up happiness of being an American. Every job he lists, there's a bunch. All of them are singing, which is usually synonymous with, you know, being happy. So it doesn't matter what job you are in America, Walt basically is saying that it doesn't matter. It's a great to be American regardless of what you do. And then when we get to line 12, the reader is kind of almost like, you could say, like, they might be tired of like him listing off all these different jobs. So you kind of might be inclined to ask, why are they singing? And Walt immediately is ready to retort this, because line 12 is each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. Basically, Walt is saying the American dream. He's basically telling the reader that they're singing, they're all happy because they're living the American dream. All right? And then now we're trailing. Now we've reached this climax of just happiness. And now we're gonna talk about the transcendentalists, because Walt Whitman was known as a transcendentalist, and the spiritual undertones that's in both Come Said My Soul and I Hear America Singing is found on the 13th line, which basically says, the 13th line starts, the day what belongs to the day. Now if you're reading that and you just kind of like glance it over, you might not catch what he's really saying, which is he's basically saying God's plan is in work, or everything happens for a reason. It doesn't have to be the Judeo-Christian God. It just is basically saying that everything has happened for a reason, and it's beautiful, because when we move, the transition from line 13 to line 14 starts with line 13 in the middle. At night, the party of young fellows, robust, friendly. And then line 14, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs, which is just like, Come Said My Soul. In Come Said My Soul, Walt Whitman is smile, which is his acceptance to the divine plan. All right? But in I Hear America Singing, the acceptance is found in everybody singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs, which is an acceptance of the plan of, you know, God's plan, or whatever Walt believed in, or whatever anyone else can believe in. That's the beauty of America, because in America we have freedom of religion, or just whatever you want to do. So, and that's why we go up, because the acceptance of the plan, everyone just is happy and they can do whatever they want. Walt Whitman, important info. Whitman was often called the Bard of Democracy, the good guy poet, and the father of free verse. His collection, Leaves of Grass, had a total of 9 editions. The first edition had 12 poems, while the final edition, also known as the Deathbed Edition, is a compilation of over 400 poems. Leaves explored transcendentalism, with emphasis on the material world and the body. Leaves came under severe criticism when it was first published because of the explicit sexual imagery that is found in the poems. Because he was taken out of school at such a young age, Whitman was primarily self-taught. Whitman's poems and journalism was noted because of his catalog style of writing. It broke from the poetic norms of the day. Whitman got his inspiration for his poems from people watching. He did this so much that he gained a reputation for being a lazy newspaper editor.